Okay, so this is going to be my second to last video now. I did one a couple hours ago, but I thought I'd fill you in on the last 2 days. So, where are we? Here we go. Okay, so yesterday was Friday. We went to Saarbrucken, the capital of Saarland, which is the region we're in. We visited the Europa Institute, which is where it's a part of Saarland University, and it's what are actually the people who are actually running this summer school. They're run out of the Europa Institute, who run an LLM, a Masters in Law in European Law. They're actually ranked top 10 in the world. So the first part of it was the lecture on Europe as a trade power, which looked a lot at Europe's share of world trade and how it's the single biggest common market in the world, and who its major trading partners are, and what sort of power it is. Where a lot of nations have fallen quite dramatically, Japan and the US, with the rise of China, the EU has remained relatively constant and stable. So the products are good, and they're still being bought. Their share in world trade is more or less the same. Some countries are hurt more than others. So, for example, France has a much smaller. It lost 39% of its share of world trade in the last decade or so. But the EU as a whole has remained relatively strong as new members have joined. We looked at how these trade agreements are worked out. So there's tariff-free trade all through the EU, obviously, and they've negotiated tariff-free trade with Canada, and they were previously looking at doing it with the US as well. Australia was a prospective partner. There was and possibly Mexico, now that Donald Trump is abolishing the North American Free Trade Agreement. Similarly, there was another partnership plan with the US called TTIP, which was the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, which is sort of the Atlantic accompaniment to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which has received heavy criticism for the way it supposedly sells out its citizens to investors. We looked at, I won't bore you with the details of this one, but we looked at pretty in depth as to whether that was true. We broke up into groups and we looked at different parts of TTIP and whether or not what the critics say about it is true, or if it's just a theory. At the end of the day, nobody really knows. It sort of came down to a let's wait and see argument. But there are some concerning aspects in there. For example, tribunals would decide how disputes under it are sorted out, and those tribunals are private. But at the same time, these tribunals can't change laws, they just can enforce compensation orders. So the argument that it might infringe the rule of law might not actually be there. Like I said, it's hard to tell. It's an area I'm not particularly well versed in, trade or trade law, so I did struggle a little bit to understand that, but it was still an interesting lecture. We also got a little graduation certificate, which was very nice. We all, got up and grabbed it and grabbed a photo and went back to our seats, which was nice. We spent the evening in the centre of Saarbrücken. We walked around. There was a lovely chocolate shop in the middle of the city, off a street that looks suspiciously like Rundle Mall. And then we hung out at one of the beer gardens, which are right on the river. Beautiful people, beautiful food, and a politician running in the upcoming German federal elections came over and tried to convince us to vote for her. But we explained that we were foreigners and couldn't vote for her, and off she went. But that was our brush with fame while in Germany, I suppose. Yes, so we had a couple of locals with us who showed us around, who were doing the course, obviously. But yeah, they took us around both the campus and the city, and it's a stunning campus, absolutely beautiful, greenery, right in the mountains, in the forest, away from everything else. Would be a lovely place to study. They tried to sell the LLM to me today, but I'm not sure I can afford to live in Germany for 6 months to a year studying a degree that I would never use in Australia. So yes, we got back to Otzenhausen kind of late last night, and then this morning we had a much needed sleep in because the lecturer was late. Dr. Christos Gotzos, who arrived in about 11:30, so he had a late lecture about the economic and monetary union, so the money side of the EU, the Eurozone, the use of the euro, and the how it's dealt with the global financial crisis. one of the big issues it has when a country goes through a sovereign debt crisis, the IMF comes in, and normally its first step is devalue your currency, which is what they tried to do in Greece. But you can't devalue the euro because it's not just you that uses it, which makes it difficult to fix sovereign debt crises. Well, we also looked at the EU's policy for banking crises, which is when a bank can't pay its debts, it's not in the best interest for the country for the bank to simply go under, because a lot of people will lose their savings. So what the government do now under EU policy is they go to the bank, they separate it into two halves, the good side and the bad side. The bad side becomes liquidated and the good side is taken over by another bank. So you go to your bank the next day after your bank has collapsed, and it will still be there, but the employees will now just work for a different bank. So it's sort of a way to save people's money while letting banks with bad practices go down the toilet. Again, not an area I'm particularly well versed in, so I did struggle a bit this morning. But it was interesting to see this fiscal policy, monetary side of it. For example, all countries except a couple, the UK and Denmark, I think, are required to instigate the euro eventually if they're a member of the EU. But Sweden has avoided it every time by missing a requirement on purpose. So part of it is you have to have an independent reserve bank, and what the Swedes seem to do is that every time they have a Eurozone assessment, a member of government sends a letter to the governor of the reserve bank telling them to do something, and they say, okay, I'll do that, which means they're not independent, which means they can't switch to the euro yet. So it's sort of an underhanded way of staying on the Swiss crown, but on the Swedish krona, sorry, but that's the way they want to do it, I suppose. So yes, after that lecture we had lunch and then another one, France under President Macron, which was very interesting to look at domestic policy, because it's not really something we've looked at yet, but we looked at how Macron is being called sort of the saviour of Europe, because he was the first big figure elected after Brexit to sort of halt populism when they thought Le Pen was going to destroy the Union. But at the moment, France is sort of considered the sick man of Europe, and they've long been victim to falling growth rates, rising deficits, and in the last 15 years they've been considerably less competitive. Like I said, they've lost 37% of their share in the world trade. They've also lost a lot of their hard and soft power resources, which reduces its status as an international actor. And since the Eastern enlargement of the EU, it's been called an ever less French Union. So they were a founding member of the Union, but they've been feeling like they're not Germany's little brother anymore. They're struggling quite significantly. But Macron sort of represents maybe a new chance. They're calling it the Macron moment. He called for a refoundation of the European project. He wants a Europe that will protect its citizens and reform the Eurozone. He wants to build a defence union, and he wants, instead of one big Europe moving together, he wants Europe to move forward in smaller groups so that more advanced nations aren't sort of held up by the less developed ones. So a big part of what he wants is protection from unfair competition. Chinese dumping practices is a big one. They can dump their excess on the European market for less than it's worth and destroy a European market in a couple of weeks, essentially. Which is something he wants to protect against, because French unemployment is obviously very high at the moment. He also wants to reform the Eurozone, give it its own budget for three purposes: allocation, stabilisation and distribution. So that's to finance investments, to counter asymmetric shocks, and solidarity for poorer member states, such as his own at the moment, I suppose. He also wants to create a European Minister for Finance and a Eurozone Parliament, which to me seems a little bit like doubling up. Like, you've got one parliament, do you really need another one? If you need to reform the way it works with the Eurozone, then that's something to do, but a whole new parliament seems like a waste of money when you're talking about how much you need more money. So not something I really understand. But people are concerned that it's sort of on the road for a transfer union, where you'll see a permanent redistribution of wealth from richer countries to poorer ones. Whether or not that's a good or a bad thing is, I suppose, depends on the level of integration within the union. And look, you could see it in Australia on some levels. Mining money from WA being used to build schools in South Australia and Tasmania. It's not a bad idea when you've got richer states to help poorer ones, but it's a bit different when you're looking at an international level and not everybody's really out to help everybody else that much. His defence union idea is interesting. He wants collaborative weapon development, procurement, commitment to invest more in defence, and a commitment to participate in crisis management, and a permanent European staff to coordinate defence, which seems like one of the steps towards the super state that everybody's worried about. If you put your army together, then that's one defining characteristic of a state, is to have an armed force, the monopoly on the legitimate use of force. And if you give that to the EU, well, they've ticked one box. How long is it going to be till they tick the others? So to achieve all this, he's sort of looking at revitalising Franco-German relations to provide European leadership. So he wants in on the success of Angela Merkel, it seems. They want to launch and deepen cooperation in subgroups with a Franco-German core, like I said, moving ahead in small groups rather than all together. And part of those subgroups will be looking at the Eurozone, defence and border protection, which are three of the big issues. And he wants to improve France's European standard by reforming the economy and bringing down deficits and debts. He's already started doing that. He announced a fairly unpopular policy regarding workers' rights, more casualisation of the workforce, that he did in substantial consultation with all parties, supposedly. The purpose of that is to fix the labour market and make France competitive again. I think whether or not it works remains to be seen, but a Machiavellian rule is to always do your worst policies first, so that there's no surprises down the track, and by the time an election comes around, you see the success of them and people will vote for you again. So if this is the worst he can do, well, then it might not be such a bad thing for France, but we'll see. A lot of European politics at the moment is just wait and see. We don't really know what's going to happen. Like this course is called A Continent in Troubled Times. Nobody's really sure. So that's my last update for substantive stuff. We've got one more lecture tomorrow before I have to leave for the airport. My friend Michelle is going to join me tomorrow to give our goodbye vlog, I suppose, and fill everybody in on another perspective. She's from the Netherlands, so she'll be giving the Dutch perspective. Thank you everybody for watching, and thank you so much again to the Hawker Youth Centre for sending me on this amazing opportunity. I've had a great time, I've learned a lot, and I'm glad I got to share it with all of you. So I will see you again in about 12 hours.